In his research into the haunted history of the United States, paranormal historian M.J. Wayland uncovered several old accounts of hauntings seemingly well known within families, down generations. Here are two of those occurrences from the late 19th century known to predict a terrible outcome. The journalist reporting a news item in Lippincott's monthly magazine wrote that he heard this account firsthand from the youngest daughter of a farmer he called Mr. G. In 1844, the successful farmer, his wife and daughter were living in Iowa. Most of the children from the G's large family had left home, and their remaining daughter was aged 18. It was early evening one summer when the farmhands were gathered to complete milking of the cows. The farmer was close by feeding the pigs, while his daughter assisted the milkmaids. At that stage, not all the cows had been herded into the yard, but were grouped outside near the public road, which was safe as the rural area was very quiet. However, suddenly a startling clamour erupted, as of a massive wagon being furiously driven and rapidly approaching the peaceful scene. Frighteningly, the pounding of the horses' hooves and clunking of the wagon wheels were distinctly heard to advance closer and closer. Mr. G shouted out to the farmhands to get off the road, as it sounded like some kind of runaway vehicle was approaching. All present rapidly retreated to the side of the road, even though nothing could as yet be seen, not even a dust cloud. However, the unsettling sounds continued to advance with increasing speed and noise until they seemed to have reached the shocked group. By this stage, the cows were showing unmistakable dread, throwing their heads back with terrified bellowing and galloping off into the nearby woods. The pigs were frantically running around inside their pen, squealing in fright. All the humans present stood wide-eyed and visibly drained, suddenly aware and in dread of the invisible threat. Having arrived at the farm, the clamorous and chaotic presence turned and seemed to pass through the fence, which sounded like it was collapsing, although it remained intact. The noise crossed the yard and struck against the pig pen fence within only a few feet of Mr. G, who stumbled back and fell into the dirt. Then, almost as if it was satisfied with its work, the clamour abruptly turned again and rushed through another fence, then down an unused timber road, before gradually fading into the distance. Meanwhile, Mrs. G had heard the disturbance and came running from the house, demanding to know what had happened and which cattle had gone missing. When told that the group present had seen nothing, she visibly blanched and shrieked the eerie question, "Which one of us does it mean?" Mrs. G espoused a conviction that her family always experienced some kind of warning of an impending death, even though neither her husband nor daughter were of the same belief. As soon as she found out that the ghostly occurrence seemed to have been targeting her own husband, she became convinced that Mr. G would be the next to go. She was not mistaken in her agonized conclusion, as only 10 days later he met with a fatal accident while helping to dig a well on his land. He had been caught in an earth cave-in and succumbed to his terrible injuries. Another chilling account of an ominous portent was sourced by Wayland as having occurred in Reeds Hill, Massachusetts. This phenomenon, which became known as the ghost clock, was investigated by a daily newspaper, the Boston Evening Transcript, in January 1898. A woman called Mrs. Pittman had reported the mysterious power of a gutted clock that had started to tick. According to the article, the clock had been examined by thousands of skeptics over the years, people including clergymen, scientists, and clock experts, but all of them had left convinced that there was no trick or deception involved, and awestruck by the perplexing phenomenon. The outdated old clock was described as comprising a simple wooden case with nothing inside it but a piece of coiled wire which had once been part of the mechanism. Mrs. Pittman claimed that its original owner was her father, but that even when it had been in his possession, it lacked both a pendulum and any inner workings. She said that, for whatever reason, he had greatly treasured the clock and kept it on the mantelpiece of a little-used room on the second floor of their house. The newspaper article decried any kind of superstitious or spiritualist bent pertaining to Mrs. Pitman and her husband. They were church-going people with no reputation for belief in the supernatural. However, Mrs. Pitman reported that when she was younger, one evening she had heard very clearly the clock strike, as if it were in perfect working order. When the strokes ended, she had turned to her father with a querying amazement. He in turn had replied, "The clock is striking for me. It means that I am going away." At the time, the young woman had given a sceptical laugh, but her father repeated his claim. He was going away and would never return. In sudden and unexplained circumstances, he did in fact pass away only a few days after that. Mrs. Pitman had forgotten her father's odd statement until some time later, when, mysteriously, the clock began to tick, giving every indication that it was now in full working order. She called her brother, who was equally bemused by the sudden unexplained activation, seemingly of an invisible pendulum powered by an invisible mechanism and with no obvious explanation of what was creating the sounds. Not believing his late father's claim that the clock's activity was an omen of impending tragedy, the brother brought in multiple clockmakers to investigate the source of the unexplained ticking. However, after weeks of analysis, the horologists were still unable to account for the eerie tick-tock coming from within the case. With a sudden awareness that her father's ghost might be causing the phenomenon, Mrs. Pitman quickly found that the clock was able to answer simple yes-no questions, and that its responses were always rational and accurate in predicting the future. The transcript reported that she had now opened her house to visitors wishing to communicate with deceased loved ones, with ostensibly their relative spirits answering their questions. Through Mrs. Pitman's mediumship, many consulted the clock and were seen to have received satisfactory information. It was reported that when visitors were musical, there could even be heard a tinkling like disembodied fingers plucking on the wire, and one astonished woman even heard the opening notes of a tune that had been a favourite of her recently deceased loved one. The mysterious aspect of both of these strange occurrences is that in each case, an older member of the family knew about the haunting phenomenon and its terrible meaning.